November 1989. A New York City meatpacking district studio called Waterworks. 4 musicians from the underground are about to record demos for their first major label album. They've invited 2 guests to weigh in. Jay Macies from Dinosaur Jr. and Don Fleming. 2 band members are uncomfortable. They've never made records with other people involved before. The working title for the album? Blowjob ? A test. A joke. A dare to their new corporate overlords at Geffen Records, home to Guns N' Roses and Aerosmith. 6 months later, the album arrives with a different name, Goo, and a cover that depicts witnesses from a notorious British murder trial. By December, it sells over 200,000 copies. The lead single reaches number 7 on alternative radio. And 1 year after that, the band takes a Seattle trio named Nirvana on a European tour that gets documented in a film called The Year Punk Broke. Sonic Youth didn't invent alternative rock, but with Goo, they proved that underground bands could sign to major labels without selling their souls. They opened the door. Nirvana walked through it, and the entire landscape of rock music shifted forever. Welcome to the Sound Vault. This is the story of Goo, the album that bridged 2 worlds. By late 1988, Sonic Youth had become the indie world's worst-kept secret. Their double album Daydream Nation, released that October on Enigma Records, earned overwhelming critical acclaim. Rolling Stone ranked it number 2 for the year. The Village Voice Paz and Ja poll voted it second best album of 1988. The NME called it the most radical and political album of the year. Even the Library of Congress would eventually preserve it in the National Recording Registry. But acclaim didn't equal accessibility. Distribution problems plagued the release. Stores couldn't keep it in stock. Thurston Moore, the band's co-founder and guitarist, later called Enigma a cheap Jack Mafioso outfit. The frustration was palpable. Here was their masterpiece, universally praised, and fans couldn't even find it in stores. Sonic Youth had been navigating the indie landscape since 1981. Thurston Moore and Kim Gordon, who had married in 1984, formed the core alongside guitarist Lee Ronaldo and drummer Steve Shelley. They'd moved from Neutral Records to Homestead to SST, always searching for better distribution, better support, better reach. The band's sound was confrontational by design. Unconventional guitar tunings, walls of feedback, songs that could veer from melodic to cacophonous in seconds. They prepared their guitars with drumsticks and screwdrivers, altering the instrument's timbre. They weren't making music for passive listening. This was noise rock as art form, and it demanded attention. Daydream Nation proved they could harness that chaos into something epic and structured. The album's opening track, Teenage Riot, reached number 20 on Billboard's Modern Rock Tracks chart, their first significant radio hit. Suddenly, major labels started calling. A&M Records, Atlantic Records, Mute Records. All came knocking. But Geffen Records made the most compelling offer, a 5-album deal worth $300,000 with a clause securing the band's complete creative control. No interference, no demands for commercial singles, just freedom. Moore and Gordon negotiated skillfully. Bob Mould from Husker Du even called Moore for advice, using their deal as a template for his own negotiations. Sonic Youth was showing other underground bands that major labels could be navigated without compromise. But there was one catch. The albums wouldn't be released on Geffen proper. Instead, they'd come out on a newly created subsidiary called DGC Records, David Geffen Company. The imprint was unproven, experimental, risky. The band felt somewhat disappointed, but the contract was signed, the underground was going corporate, and the purists were already sharpening their knives. The vision for Goo emerged from contradiction. After Daydream Nation's sprawling 70-minute journey, complete with extended psychedelic intros and atmospheric outros, Sonic Youth wanted to strip things down. Make songs that began and ended abruptly. Capture the raw energy of their live shows without sacrificing their experimental edge. They'd spent years watching hip-hop dominate the cultural conversation. Public Enemy's It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, NWA's Straight Outta Compton, The future of music felt revolutionary and black and urgent. Meanwhile, guitar-based rock felt stagnant, saturated with arena rock theatrics and hair metal excess. Kim Gordon had been particularly drawn to rap music since LL Cool J's 1985 debut Radio. She loved its directness, its confrontational energy, its refusal to apologize. When Spin magazine asked her to interview LL Cool J in 1989, she saw an opportunity to explore common ground between underground punk and mainstream hip-hop. The interview was a disaster. LL Cool J, at the height of his Walking with a Panther success, arrived aloof and disinterested. When Gordon tried to draw parallels between his experiences as a black artist in a white-dominated industry and her experiences as a woman in a male-dominated rock scene, he wasn't buying it. When she mentioned Iggy Pop's influence on punk, he admitted he loved Bon Jovi instead. When she asked about women, he said a guy has to have control over his woman. Gordon left the interview feeling foolish, elite, naive. The downtown art scene she came from suddenly felt incredibly small and insular. But she took notes, and she turned that awkwardness into art. The song that emerged, Cool Thing, would become Goo's lead single. It referenced LL Cool J's music while never naming him. It questioned gender dynamics and racial politics and corporate oppression. And it featured Chuck D from Public Enemy in the breakdown, adding legitimacy and edge. The album's title came from a different source entirely. Raymond Pettibon, the artist brother of Black Flag's Greg Ginn, had been creating drawings for Sonic Youth throughout the 80s. In his 1989 short film Surdrone, there was a character named Goo. Gordon thought it would be funny to name the album after this minor character. Funny in that shape-shifting, ironic, impossible-to-pin-down way that defined the band's entire aesthetic. They originally wanted to call it Blowjob ? Inspired by a Pettibon drawing of Joan Crawford with bright red lips and that provocative text underneath. They knew Geffen would reject it. They proposed it anyway. Geffen begged them to reconsider. They agreed, but only after making their point. We're not here to play by your rules. Recording Goo became an exercise in controlled chaos. Nick Sansano, who had engineered Daydream Nation, returned for this album. Sansano was primarily known for his hip-hop work, having mixed Public Enemy's Black Steel in The Hour of Chaos and Rob Bass's It Takes Two. He understood punch and power and how to make noise sound intentional. Geffen gave them a sizable budget, far more than they'd ever had on indie labels. Sansano recommended they book time at Sorcerer Sound in New York, a studio equipped with two 24-track consoles. This meant unlimited overdubs, unlimited layers, unlimited experimentation. But that freedom created its own problems. Lee Ranaldo later admitted the recording became frustrating. It took us forever to get final takes. Something would inevitably go wrong for somebody and we'd have to start again. The band was used to working quickly, capturing raw energy in minimal takes. Now they had time and money and options, and it bogged them down. They hung microphones from catwalks, isolated Steve Shelley in a drum booth, piled on overdubs in ways they'd never attempted before. The 1-minute track Scooter and Jinx featured anywhere from 4 to 24 tracks of Thurston Moore making amplifier feedback, all layered together into excruciating sonic assault. Midway through recording, tensions emerged. The band members each had different philosophies about arranging the music. These philosophies conflicted with what Geffen expected from a radio-friendly album. Sansano felt unsure about the album's direction. After basic tracks were completed, they moved to Green Street Studios to finish overdubs. But when Geffen executive Gary Gersh and the band listened to Sansano's initial mixes, both parties had concerns. The sound wasn't quite right. The energy felt muffled. They made a difficult decision. Hire a veteran producer to handle the final mixes. They chose Ron St. Germain, a jazz musician turned producer best known for Bad Brains' Eye Against E. Sansano voluntarily left the project, but he was so dejected by the band's lack of faith that he refused to speak to them for years afterward. St. Germain brought clarity without sacrificing edge. He understood how to make noise sound defined rather than muddy. During mastering at Masterdisc, Moore played engineer Howie Weinberg Nirvana's Bleach album, saying he'd be very happy if the record sounded like that. Weinberg was surprised. Bleach had been recorded for $600, and here was Moore with a major label budget wanting that primitive, raw quality. Don Fleming and Jay Macias, who had produced the demo sessions, returned to add backing vocals to several tracks. Chuck D came in to record his parts for Kool Thing. Kim Gordon had initially wanted LL Cool J himself to appear, but that obviously wasn't happening after their interview disaster. The album they created was deliberately contradictory. Accessible but abrasive. Melodic but noisy. Songs like Dirty Boots opened with gentle, almost dreamy verses before exploding into distorted choruses. Mary Christ was pure bratty punk energy. Moat spiraled from gothic atmospherics into violent noise assaults. Titanium Exposé sampled LL Cool J's Jingling Baby while telling a story about impoverished urban artists enriched by creative connection. And then there was Tunic. Song for Karen. A haunting meditation on Karen Carpenter's death from anorexia. Gordon's vocals were deadpan and devastating, juxtaposing artistic immortality against physical decay. "You ain't ever going anywhere," she repeated, turning tragedy into a kind of dark permanence. The struggle wasn't just in the studio, it was in what the album represented. Signing to Geffen meant entering a world where creative control clashed daily with commercial expectations. The Blowjob ? Title was just the beginning. Every decision became a negotiation. The album cover became another battleground. After abandoning the Joan Crawford drawing, the band chose a different Pettibon piece. A stark black and white illustration of two people in sunglasses sitting in a car, with comic book-style text reading, "I stole my sister's boyfriend." It was all whirlwind heat and flash. "Within a week we killed my parents and hit the road." What most people didn't know, what even Pettibon initially didn't realize, was that the drawing was based on a real photograph. The couple depicted were Maureen Hindley and David Smith, witnesses in the infamous 1966 Moores murders trial. Maureen's sister Myra Hindley and her partner Ian Brady had killed 5 children. David Smith had witnessed one murder and testified against them. Thurston Moore said the audacious correlation of criminals hitting the road and a rock and roll band hitting the road seemed like an edgy gesture. It had beat literature vibes, Jack Kerouac energy, rebellion without clear boundaries. Geffen executives were nervous. This wasn't standard album art for a major label debut, but contractually, Sonic Youth had final say. Then there was the Kool Thing video. Kim Gordon wanted to wear a beret and carry an Uzi as a self-described poser leftist girl, lusting after Black Panther's concept. Geffen vetoed it immediately. Too provocative, too risky, especially with potential MTV exposure on the line. Gordon backed down, understanding that some compromises were necessary. But the bigger struggle was internal and philosophical. Longtime fans were already crying sellout before the album even dropped. The indie community that had supported Sonic Youth through years of obscurity felt betrayed. You don't sign to the label that houses Guns N' Roses and keep your underground credibility. That was the thinking. Lee Ranaldo and Steve Shelley had been uncomfortable from the start about bringing Don Fleming and Jay Macias into the studio. "We'd never made records before where there were other people involved," Ranaldo said. The band's entire ethos had been about self-determination. Now they had outside producers, label executives, marketing departments, the infrastructure of corporate rock surrounding them. Moore defended the move, saying they were buying in rather than selling out. But the distinction felt semantic to many. The result was the same: Sonic Youth on a major label. The question was whether they could maintain their artistic integrity while navigating that system. Goo was released on June 26, 1990. Geffen approached promotion carefully. They understood Sonic Youth's fanbase was suspicious of corporate tactics. So Mark Cates, a Geffen executive, implemented grassroots strategies. He arranged for the band to visit college radio stations in the weeks before release. They did interviews with music journalists. They played small shows. The approach was indie despite the major label backing. Kool Thing was released as the lead single in early June. The video, directed by Tamra Davis, featured the band in glam-style clothing, go-go dancers, and black and white cinematography styled after LL Cool J's Going Back to Cali video. Spin magazine designated it one of the greatest music videos of 1990. The song quickly found its audience. Alternative radio embraced it. MTV's Buzzbin put it in regular rotation. By summer, Kool Thing reached number 7 on Billboard's Modern Rock Tracks chart, the band's highest charting single to date. It also hit number 81 in the UK Top 100. Critics responded with enthusiasm. Rolling Stone's David Fricke called Goo a brilliant, extended essay in refined primitivism that deftly reconciles rock's structural conventions with the band's twin passions for violent tonal elasticity and garage punk holocaust. He viewed it as Sonic Youth's most accessible work without compromising their experimental tendencies. Other publications agreed. The album felt radical even by 1990 major label standards. It captured something happening in youth culture, a growing disillusionment with stadium rock theatrics and mock metal posturing. Guns N' Roses and Alice Cooper felt increasingly out of touch. Goo felt dangerous and real and current. By December 1990, the album had sold over 200,000 copies, a massive number for an underground band. It peaked at number 96 on the Billboard 200, the band's highest chart position to date. The 15-week run on the chart was the longest for any Sonic Youth album. The commercial success exceeded Geffen's expectations, but it remained modest by major label standards. Pop radio didn't touch it. MTV airplay was limited to late-night alternative programming. This wasn't Nevermind-level breakthrough, but it proved alternative rock had an audience that labels were ignoring. In August, Sonic Youth embarked on a North American tour. Halfway through, they brought a little-known Seattle band along as support, Nirvana. The grunge trio had just recorded demos with producer Butch Vig. They were unknown outside the Pacific Northwest, but Thurston Moore and Kim Gordon had seen them perform at Maxwell's in Hoboken, New Jersey the previous year and were convinced of their brilliance. Gordon in particular championed Nirvana to Geffen executives. Her advocacy helped push the label to sign the band in 1990. That decision would change everything a year later. Goo's impact wasn't immediate, it was gradual and structural. The album proved that underground bands could maintain artistic integrity on major labels if the contract terms were right. Sonic Youth retained complete creative control. They released an album with a murder trial cover and provocative title options. They included noise experiments and feminist critique and genre-defying songwriting. And it sold. That blueprint became crucial for the alternative rock explosion that followed. When Nirvana signed to Geffen's DGC imprint, they followed Sonic Youth's path. When Smashing Pumpkins and Hole and Pavement negotiated deals, they referenced Sonic Youth's contract. The band became tastemakers and gatekeepers, showing other artists how to navigate the system. Their influence extended beyond business dealings. Musically, Goo demonstrated that alternative rock didn't have to choose between accessibility and experimentation. Dirty Boots had sing-along choruses and blistering noise sections. Kool Thing was radio-friendly and politically confrontational. Moat was gothic and terrifying and exhilarating. Critics later identified Goo as a crucial piece of the puzzle for understanding how alternative artists brought the underground to the mainstream. The album appeared at exactly the right moment, after the indie scene had matured, but before grunge exploded. It was a bridge album, a transition point, a proof of concept. When Nirvana's Nevermind became a surprise blockbuster in late 1991, Sonic Youth benefited directly. Their next album, Dirty, was heavily promoted by Geffen. The label saw them as elder statespeople of the alternative movement. Their touring schedule expanded. Their influence grew. They headlined the 1995 Lollapalooza Festival alongside Hole and Pavement and Cypress Hill. Sonic Youth's 1991 European tour with Nirvana, Dinosaur Jr., and Mudhoney was documented in the film 1991, The Year Punk Broke. The movie captured alternative rock at its tipping point, still underground enough to feel authentic, but large enough to matter commercially. Footage shows Thurston Moore pulling Kurt Cobain out of a crowd after Nirvana's set. Moore and Gordon had become protective, almost parental figures to Cobain, guiding him through major label pressures they'd recently navigated themselves. But Goo's most lasting impact was philosophical. It challenged the indie community's rigid definitions of authenticity and sellout culture. Sonic Youth proved you could work within corporate structures without being defined by them. You could use major label resources, bigger budgets, better distribution, professional producers, while maintaining your artistic vision. As one critic noted, Goo marked the last moment in our culture when selling out was still possible. By the 2000s, the concept had lost meaning, but in 1990, Sonic Youth's decision felt genuinely brave. They risked their underground credibility to reach a wider audience, and they did it without compromise. The sellout accusation started immediately and never fully stopped. Longtime fans felt betrayed, message boards and zines filled with criticism. You could hear it in record store conversations and at punk shows. Sonic Youth, the band that had defined underground integrity, was now on the same label as Whitesnake and Cher. How could that be anything but compromise? Some critics pointed to the album's more accessible songwriting as evidence of watering down their sound. Compared to earlier albums like Sister or Daydream Nation, Goo felt more structured, more conventional. Songs had clear verses and choruses. Feedback sections were shorter. The experimental impulses felt reined in. This criticism ignored crucial context. Sonic Youth had always balanced noise with melody. Their progression toward accessibility had been happening gradually since Bad Moon Rising. Sister already mixed experimental tendencies with digestible pop song structures. Goo wasn't a radical departure, it was a natural evolution. But perception mattered more than reality. The very act of signing to Geffen triggered suspicion. It didn't matter that the band maintained creative control. It didn't matter that they'd negotiated carefully. For many purists, the decision itself was unforgivable. Lee Ranaldo addressed this in later interviews, expressing frustration with the binary thinking. Either you were underground and authentic, or you were mainstream and corrupt. There was no middle ground. No acknowledgement that artists might have legitimate reasons for seeking better distribution and larger audiences. The controversy extended to Kool thing itself. Some listeners found Kim Gordon's political commentary shallow or performative. A privileged white woman asking Chuck D about liberating girls from male white corporate oppression felt tone-deaf to some critics. Was Gordon mocking herself? Mocking LL Cool J? Both? Neither? The song's layered irony made it difficult to parse. Author Elisa Chappelle later wrote that Gordon was writing in code, using seemingly throwaway lines like, "I just want you to know we can still be friends" to mask real aggression. It was passive-aggressive feminism, using conditional language to express unconditional anger. The album cover's connection to the Moores murders also generated controversy, though mostly in retrospect. At the time, many American listeners didn't recognize the source photograph, but as the album's popularity grew and the cover became iconic, endlessly parodied and referenced, the dark history behind Pettibon's drawing emerged. Some found it distastefully exploitative, others saw it as appropriately punk and confrontational. Nick Sansano's dismissal from the project created behind-the-scenes tension. He'd engineered their breakthrough album and returned for this one, only to be replaced during mixing. His refusal to speak with the band for years afterward suggested real hurt beyond professional disappointment. And then there was the ultimate controversy. Did Goo work? Did it achieve its goal of bridging underground and mainstream without compromising either? The answer depended on who you asked. Commercially, it exceeded expectations. Critically, it received praise. But culturally, it satisfied neither the indie purists who wanted Sonic Youth to stay underground, nor the major label executives who wanted crossover pop success. Which might have been exactly the point. Goo existed in the margins, refusing easy categorization. It was too weird for top 40 radio, too accessible for noise purists, too political for casual listeners, and too ironic for earnest critics. In retrospect, that uncomfortable middle position made it more influential, not less. Goo proved alternative rock could exist outside binary categories. It could be commercially viable without being commercial, experimental without being alienating, political without being preachy. 35 years later, Goo remains Sonic Youth's most culturally significant album. Not their best. Many critics and fans still prefer Daydream Nation or Dirty or Sister. But they're most important in terms of historical impact. The album that made everything else possible. When Gen Z discovers Sonic Youth today, they often start with Goo. The album's more structured songwriting provides an entry point before diving into the band's noisier work. Dirty Boots and Cool Thing show up on streaming playlists alongside Nirvana and Pixies and Pavement. The songs feel timeless in ways that perfectly capture 1990s transitional moment. The Raymond Pettibon cover has transcended the album itself. It's become one of the most parodied and referenced images in music history, right up there with the Beatles' Abbey Road or the Velvet Underground's Banana. Artists have recreated it with characters from Stranger Things, The Office, and countless other pop culture properties. Pettibon himself seems bemused by its enduring popularity, hesitating to analyze or make sense of it for fear of breaking the spell. Musicians cite Goo as a turning point in how they thought about independence and compromise. You can hear its influence in bands like Pavement, Yo La Tengo, Sleater-Kinney, and Deer Hunter. Not necessarily in direct musical imitation, Sonic Youth's sound was too idiosyncratic to copy, but in the philosophical approach, the refusal to choose between artistic integrity and larger audiences, the insistence that you could work within systems without being defined by them. Paste magazine named it the third best album of 1990. Recent retrospectives consistently place it among the essential alternative rock albums. It appears on Best of the Decade lists alongside Nevermind, Loveless, and OK Computer, albums that fundamentally changed how people thought about guitar-based music. The album's production approach, piling on overdubs, layering guitars, creating maximum density, influenced how alternative bands recorded in the 90s. The Smashing Pumpkins' Siamese Dream, My Bloody Valentine's Loveless, Radiohead's The Bends, all share Goo's commitment to sonic thickness and textural complexity. Kim Gordon's vocal delivery on Goo became a template for alternative rock frontwomen. Her deadpan, almost spoken-word style influenced PJ Harvey, Cat Power, and Juliana Hatfield. The way she mixed vulnerability with aggression, irony with sincerity, opened new possibilities for how women could present themselves in rock music. When Sonic Youth finally left Geffen in 2008 due to dissatisfaction with promotional efforts, it felt like closing a chapter. They'd spent 18 years on the label, releasing some of their most beloved work. But the major label experiment had run its course. They signed with independent Matador Records, completing a full-circle journey back to the indie world. The band's breakup in 2011, following Kim Gordon and Thurston Moore's divorce, ended one of alternative rock's most important partnerships. They never reunited. They never will. But Goo remains, still challenging listeners with its contradictions. In 2007, Geffen released a deluxe edition featuring the original demos recorded with Don Fleming and Jay Mascis. Hearing the rough versions reveals how much the songs evolved during recording. Bookstore became Moat. Mildred Pierce stretched to over 8 minutes. The demos captured something raw that the final album polished into focused intensity. Today's streaming era has given Goo new life. Younger listeners discover it divorced from its original context, unaware of the sellout controversies or indie scene politics. They just hear great songs, noise and melody, power and experimentation. Music that still sounds vital 35 years later. That might be Goo's greatest legacy. It transcended its moment while perfectly capturing it. The album exists simultaneously as a 1990 artifact and a timeless statement. It proved that underground bands could navigate mainstream structures. It influenced the alternative explosion without being consumed by it. It remained defiantly itself while opening doors for others. The story of Goo is the story of impossible balances. How do you stay true to your experimental roots while seeking wider audiences? How do you work with corporate entities without becoming corporate yourself? How do you evolve as artists without alienating your core supporters? How do you make noise music accessible without dulling its edge? Sonic Youth didn't have perfect answers. Their solution was simply to refuse the premise of the questions. They rejected the idea that these were binary choices. You could be underground and major label, experimental and accessible, political and pop, all at once, simultaneously, without apology. The band spent 30 years proving that artistic freedom wasn't about who distributed your music. It was about the terms of the contract and the strength of your vision. They showed generations of musicians that you could use corporate resources without being consumed by corporate logic. Goo sold 200,000 copies. It charted at 96. It spawned one alternative radio hit. By major label standards, it was modest. By underground standards, it was massive. It existed in that productive tension between worlds, never fully belonging to either. And maybe that's exactly where the best art lives. In the margins, in the transitions, in the spaces between clear categories. Not underground or mainstream. Not noise or melody. Not compromise or purity. Just music. Complicated, contradictory, uncompromising music. Sonic Youth made an album about contradictions in 1990. They gave it a shape-shifting name and a murder trial cover. They filled it with feedback and hooks, politics and irony, rage and beauty. They refused to choose between audiences or aesthetics or authenticity. And 35 years later, Goo still sounds like nothing else. Still challenges, still inspires, still proves that the most revolutionary act is refusing to play by anyone's rules but your own. This has been the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. And some stories, like Sonic Youth's, teach us that the lines we draw between worlds are always more permeable than we think.